All right, so we're here today to cover the R134A AC systems, and we're going to go over a few basics that will help the average DIYer fix most AC problems at home. All right, so before we jump into the 134A, we'll take just a second and we talk about what was invented first, and that was the R12 refrigerant known as Freon. It's commonly known in the industry today. It's still known. If you go into a shop and say, my AC system's low, I need a shot of Freon, they'll know exactly what you want. Even though R134A is not technically Freon, and Freon was an actual brand name at one time, everybody knows what that means. R12 was created sometime in the 1920s, 1928 I believe, and was used in the automobile industry until 1994, at which time they switched over to 134A. It was believed that the R12 was contributing to depletion of the ozone, which is it's a topic of, well, it's just to say it's highly debated. I wished I had kept the article that I saw many years ago. It actually discussed and was a discussion, and it came from the EPA themselves, and it actually came out and said that the R12 was not depleting the ozone as much as they once thought it was. But since they had basically went on to say that since they had developed the R134A, they were not going to be going back to the R12, and like I said, it was a long article, and I wished I had kept it because it had a lot of good information in it and basically said that they were wrong. So with all that said, let's talk about the 134A system. The R12 and the 134A system, they work exactly the same. It's just using a slightly different chemical. So we're going to start at the heart of your AC system, which is right here. Here's your compressor. You have a belt-driven pulley which spins free, and the compressor does not turn until you tell it to come on. It has an electromagnetic plate on the front of the compressor, and you can spin the compressor independently of the pulley. What happens when it becomes energized is this outer plate, like I said, is an electromagnet, and it locks the spinning pulley to the internal portion of the compressor, which begins the whole process of moving the refrigerant through the AC system. The basics of an AC system: you see you have a blue, which represents the low side, and you have the red, which represents the high side. A compressor cannot compress liquid refrigerant. It can only process and force gas and compress gas, as in vapor, through the AC system. So how it works, a real quick overview, is in a gaseous form, the AC compressor takes the refrigerant, compresses it, pushes it out through the high side and through the condenser. The condenser, which is not easily seen, but on almost all systems, unless it is a standalone system with electric fans, is out in front of your car's radiator. You can look inside the grill of the car, and you can see the AC condenser. So as the gas, the vapor, has been compressed and is now high pressure, goes through the condenser coil on the front of the engine. There is a fan that is pulling air across the coils of the condenser. As the gas cools down, it begins to change into a liquid. It is now changes over from a high pressure gas to a high pressure liquid as it's going through the coils and cools down. Then it's going to come out of the condenser and it's going to go through what's called a receiver dryer. The receiver dryer serves a couple purposes. It is an extra reservoir to help hold a little more refrigerant. It has what's called a desiccant bag, which is like a little desiccant pack like you see comes in a pair of tennis shoes. It helps absorb moisture. Any moisture that might happen to be in the system would get absorbed into the desiccant packet. And as I said, it also serves as a storage device to help hold a little bit extra Freon like a tank. So your refrigerant passes out of the condenser into your receiver dryer and then out and onto the evaporator. All right, so your evaporator is going to be located underneath the passenger side of your vehicle's dash as a general rule. In this case, it is the same on this 54 Ford as most any other modern car. This aftermarket system has an expansion valve located behind that cover right there. We said that the next thing in line is the evaporator, and the refrigerant coming to this aluminum block, which is your expansion valve, is coming in as a high pressure gas. As it passes through the expansion valve, it allows the refrigerant to expand. Once it expands, it changes over to a low pressure liquid. As the liquid is passing through the coils, which are located inside this case, air is being forced across the coils, and a chemical change happens, and the refrigerant begins to boil. As the refrigerant begins to boil, it is turning back into a gas. As that gas is released inside the tubes of the evaporator coil, and the air is being forced across the outside of it, the heat is being transferred from the air into the refrigerant. So as the gas begins to exit the evaporator coils, it will come back through the expansion valve and back to the compressor, and it has been changed into a low pressure gas and goes back to the compressor and is ready to be compressed again, and the whole process start over. There's a lot of science and wizardry and witchcraft involved in the AC system. Not really, just kidding. But there is some science that goes into it, and it helps to understand that process as you're working on an AC system. To keep what's going on, what's supposed to happen, and when in your AC system can help you repair it. In the case of this AC system on my 1954 Ford, right here we have a switch. This pressure switch tells the fan to come on. It also tells the AC compressor that there's refrigerant in the system and it is safe to come on. I have always had a small leak in this area right here, and I always thought that it was these lines right here at these fittings, okay? And the system, and when it first started having problems, would hold refrigerant for a month or two, and then it would get a little low and it didn't want to work right. So we'd charge it back up and it would work good for a little while, and then we'd make it through until we got to, say, the fall season, and then we wouldn't need the AC anymore, and we'd just forget about it and charge it up next year. Well, eventually you got to the point to where you could charge the AC system and it would last maybe a week and a half. And this is not a car that we drive all the time, so every time we got in it, AC would not work. I had ignored it. All right, so the other day I charged up the AC system and I was going to look for the leak. I was going to hunt it down until I found the leak, and I was going to start right here. So what I found was, as soon as I charged the system, this switch looked like a volcano right out of the top. It was spraying Freon everywhere, so it had finally failed to the point that there was no doubt of where the leak was. So I have ordered a switch. We're going to replace the switch, pull the system into a vacuum, and recharge the system and see if that fixes the AC. Alright, so we have the new switch, you can see right there, is wired in place, and now we are about to get ready to prepare the vehicle to be recharged. Alright, so if you're going to recharge the AC system and do any service work to one, you really need to get a set of manifold gauges. They're going to have the special fittings and adapters you need to connect directly to the service ports on the AC system. It has this yellow service hose, which is used for your charge line, and it is also used for connecting to a vacuum pump. So that's what we're about to do, is we're about to pull a vacuum on the AC system. The purpose for pulling a vacuum on your AC system is to pull out any air and moisture, because in air, the air we breathe in and out, it is generally saturated with moisture. So when you pull a vacuum on it, it removes and pulls that moisture out of the system. So that's what we're about to do. Both gauge valves open, so you're pulling a vacuum from both sides. This is zero pressure, and this is inches of mercury. And you'll want to do this for a minimum 30 minutes. Yeah, my vacuum pump is old, little janky, but it works. Alright, we've been holding in a vacuum really close to 30 inches of mercury. And again, reason for pulling it into a vacuum is to pull all the air, all the moisture out of the system. So, we've been going about 30 minutes. We're going to shut the vacuum down, and we're going to let the system sit for just a few minutes. We're going to make sure that it holds a solid vacuum. That is an indication of leaks if it does not hold a solid vacuum. So we have been sitting for a solid 5 minutes. The gauges have remained steady, and when we tested it before with the bad switch, it took it just a few seconds. Well, within 20 or 30 seconds you could begin to see the pressure rising in the system. So after 5 minutes we have no movement on the gauge. Now it's time to look at charging it. So before we go any further, what we're going to do right now is we're going to go ahead and we're going to close both of the manifold gauges. Now we're going to go down to our vacuum pump, and we're going to have our refrigerant standing by. You're going to disconnect your yellow service port from the vacuum pump, and you're going to hook it to the fill port on the refrigerant tank. Most people are not going to have a 30-pound cylinder. You're going to be in 1-pound containers usually, or excuse me, 12-ounce containers. They don't come in 1-pound containers anymore. So you will probably have an adapter clamp that fits to your yellow line, and you'll clamp onto the can. But in this case, I have a large cylinder, and you're going to open the valve, and you're going to turn the cylinder upside down. Make sure that you have enough line slack to do that. Alright, so now that we have that done, we will open the low side port, and it will begin to put refrigerant into the system. Alright, we're going to close it after we have let it take some in. And now we're going to go inside and crank the vehicle and see if the AC will actually come on. Looking at our manifold gauges and our pressures. We're going to see where the pressures are running. Low side is about 30 pounds. High side is around 210, 225, somewhere in there, 215. We're going to let it run for a few minutes. Circulate Freon through the system. Move oil through the system. Try to let's see if everything will settle out. Come back where it needs to be. Alright, so after we let it run for a little while, the pressures came around, they were doing great, and we actually had a center vent temp of about 51 degrees. The longer we let it run, it was actually dropped into the 40s. So now let's talk about pressures. So we're going to talk a little bit about pressures and in relation to the 134A system and what you're looking for. We're going to cover a couple of basics. I think where people get a lot of confusion coming in is when they don't take into account the outside temperature and humidity. Which if you just don't even worry about the humidity, if you just base it on the outside temperature, you can get a good idea of a refrigerant charge in your system from a static standpoint. Just hooking up the gauges, looking at where the pressures are, and seeing what's in the system. As a matter of fact, that's what we're going to start with. The system has been charged and done for about 2 weeks. About a week ago I cranked it up. It was still getting cold, and so we're going to go with hopefully that was the only leak that we had. You're going to know at the same time I do whether or not this system is still tight and holding refrigerant. So let's hook up these gauges and find out. Alright, this is a slightly different set of gauges than what I had the other day. These are some that I put together from several different pieces of equipment. Everything, as far as I know, is good to go. Nothing leaks. And the set I had was a set I borrowed from work that we use all the time, and they're pretty new, so I knew those were accurate. So we're going to hook these up and see what we get. Whoop, make sure I don't get any of that. I don't need any hissing. All right. That one still shows that it's got pressure. This one, oh, come on baby, is a little bit tight. Whoop, we got us a leak. There we go. Still got a leak. There we go. I did say this is an old set. All right, so let's get around here and take a look at our pressures. Oh, that's going to be perfect. All right, so this is a classic example of what I wanted to show you. The system is still sitting at, it looks like 97 to 98 psi. It's very close on both gauges. You can see on the low side gauge, which is the blue gauge, It is incremented a little finer than the high pressure side, but you can tell that they're right in the same ballpark. Now let's talk about it. All right, so let's go talk about pressures just a little bit more. Let's talk about high side pressure. I recently learned this, and I'm not sure if it was Vintage Air that a friend of mine told me that this came from, but what they recommended on your high side running pressures when the compressor is running, how you calculate that pressure is outside ambient air temperature on a 90-degree day. You take that 90 degrees, you multiply that times 2, and then you add 10% to it. So 90 times 2 is 180. Then 10%, that would be 18. So you're going to be looking roughly at your high side on a very hot day running around 200 psi. And of course, the hotter the temperature, so you're working outside in direct sunlight, you got to factor in. So if you have a system that you're charging and working on, trying to diagnose, and it's out in the direct hot sun, and your high side pressures are around 225, it's doing what it's supposed to do. You're in the ballpark. You've got about enough refrigerant in it. Stop adding. One of the biggest problems I see is people overcharging, thinking they need to build their head pressure even higher. You don't want to do that, because you have the vehicle, the hotter it gets, the more head pressure you're going to get. So only charge by pressure to what it needs. Don't exceed it. What I have seen through the years and have experienced personally is actually a slightly undercharged system will cool a little bit better with 134A than a slightly overcharged system. Now let's talk about the low side pressures. I don't have a formula to calculate for the low side pressures, but what my personal experience is with low side pressures, and it has to do if the vehicle's been inside the shop, it's shaded, it's not necessarily boiling like it's been out in the sun. Your running pressures are generally about 35 psi to 40 psi. If it's been out in the sun, boiling, baking in the sun, and you're charging your AC system, yeah, your pressures are going to be a little bit higher. They'll run up to 45 psi until the interior of the vehicle begins to cool down some. The further the interior of the vehicle cools down, the lower that pressure is going to be. Generally what I see, I'm here in the South, I'm in central Mississippi, generally what I see with most low side AC pressures are they run around between 27, 28, sometimes as low as 25, depending on the time of year, to 35. When the AC compressor is cooling and doing exactly what it's supposed to do. 25 to 35 psi on the low side. So let's crank this thing up and see if we still got air conditioner. The gauges say we do. All right, let's take a look. We got the high side going up and the low side going up. AC fan is cycling. As soon as the fan comes on, it comes back down. Pressure going up. Fan comes on. Pressures go back down. All right, well, the AC is still cooling just like it's supposed to be. So I want to cover a couple more little quick things with air conditioning systems and what to look for and what to do about them. Let's say you have charged your system and you feel pretty confident that you haven't overcharged it with refrigerant. You are getting some cool inside the vehicle, but your head pressure is going way too high. Say your head pressure should be, you've calculated it, and your head pressure ought to be no more than about 220 at the most. Calculated. But in actual practice, your head pressure is running 300, 310, 315, and so it's going over to 350. Low side's fairly close to what it's supposed to be. Chances are you have a problem with your cooling fan. Either you do not have enough fan, or the fan you have is not pulling enough air across the condenser. One way you can test this and check to see if that is what the problem is if you're in a position where you can get a garden hose over to the vehicle, start running cool water across your condenser, watching your gauges. If you can run cool water across your condenser and the temperature inside the vehicle begins to drop and your high side pressure begins to drop back into the normal range, and to get where you want it to be, say around 220, 210, 200, running water makes it work like it's supposed to, that will tell you that you don't have enough fan on your condenser, and possibly your condenser may not be big enough to do the job. Probably the first. It's probably you don't have enough airflow. Now, let's say you have charged your system and you begin to run the compressor. Your high side's too high, and your low side is too high. Both of them are not within range, and you can't get them to come down. Head pressure is going excessive, and your low side won't pull back down. Chances are you have overcharged your system, and you need to let a little bit of the Freon out. You need to recover it. You need to recover it. That is probably the most common cause of AC problems, and the DIY person is overcharging their system. Again, like I said a few minutes ago, running your AC system actually a slightly undercharged is better than running your system overcharged. Running your AC system undercharged is likely not going to damage anything. Running it overcharged will damage and stress your compressor. So don't overcharge your AC system. Now let's go. We're going to cover one last thing. You've charged your AC system, your low side's pulling into a vacuum, and you're not building any head pressure. You don't have enough refrigerant in the system. Sneak up on it. That valve right here will open and close. You're going to be charging through the low side on a DIY AC repair, most likely. Just crack the valve and let a little bit more in. You want to do it a little bit at a time. Let the gauges settle and watch them. If you're beginning to build a little bit of head pressure, just remember the 2 times the ambient air temperature plus 10%, and when you start edging towards that number, say you're just below it, just compare it to your low side. Low side should be around 30 to 35. When you get there, stop putting Freon in, okay? So to recap real quick, if your low side's pulling into a vacuum or pulling low on the gauge and you're not building head pressure, you probably don't have enough Freon. If your high side and your low side gauges are exceeding what they should be, say your low side is at 45-50 psi and won't come down, and it's not making cool air, and your high pressure side is going over 300, you've probably overcharged it, okay? When you hook your gauges up, your gauges on a static system that hasn't been run, just hooked to a static unrun system, should be reflective of very close to what the ambient outside temperature should be. So if it's 90 degrees, you should have 90 psi on the high side and the low side on a system that has been sitting around and not run. That should tell you that you have enough Freon in your system that you don't need to do anything to it. If your compressor won't run, you need to find out what's going on. You've probably got something electrical that has failed. And the last thing, the low side looks pretty good, but the high side's running too high. You probably don't have enough airflow across your condenser. Alright, so I hope I've given you some good information. We didn't talk too much on the topics of safety when you're dealing with refrigerant. They always taught us that we should be using cotton gloves because the refrigerant can freeze your skin. You probably want to have on some safety glasses because you don't want to get refrigerant oil squirted in your eye at high pressure. That would be bad as well. You know, I've been doing this stuff a long time, and I kind of know my way around it. It could still happen to me, and yeah, I probably need to have on the safety equipment, but no, I don't. Roast me in the comments, that's fine. Now, what we're currently working on with this vehicle is we seemed to have developed a driveline vibration. So that's where I have the drive shaft and why I can't move the vehicle around right now. It's actually at a driveline repair shop getting the drive shaft inspected. So while we're working to figure out why this thing's vibrating, why don't you go out and watch another one coming on the screen right now.